The Auckland Islands lie 500 kilometers south of New Zealand's South Island, positioned at 50 degrees south latitude in the subantarctic belt of the Southern Ocean. The archipelago consists of volcanic rock shaped by wind and water into steep cliffs, narrow inlets, and forested valleys that descend toward the sea. Rata and southern beech trees grow dense in sheltered areas, their branches draped with moss and lichen. The ground is spongy with peat. Rain falls frequently. Fog obscures the coastline for days at a time. No permanent human settlement exists here. The islands are distant from all shipping lanes. Seals once congregated on the beaches in large numbers, drawing occasional hunting vessels in the mid-19th century, but by the 1860s even these visits had become rare. The surrounding waters are cold, turbulent, and unforgiving. Storms move through without warning. The wind is constant. This is not a place where ships intend to go. It is a place where ships are lost. The schooner Grafton departed Sydney, Australia in November 1863. She was a small vessel, just over 20 meters in length, built for coastal work but capable of open ocean passage. Her captain, Thomas Musgrave, was an experienced navigator, 40 years old, originally from England. He had spent years in the merchant trade and knew the southern waters well. The voyage's purpose was economic, to hunt seals in the subantarctic islands and return with skins for sale. Musgrave had assembled a crew of 4 men. François Reynal, a Frenchman in his early 30s, served as the ship's mate. He had studied engineering and possessed practical knowledge of mechanics, metalwork, and construction. Henry Forbes, also French, was a sailor with experience in the Pacific trade. George Harris, Norwegian by birth, worked as an able seaman. Alexander McLaren, the youngest of the group, was a Portuguese sailor who had joined the crew in Sydney. The men were not friends. They were professionals brought together by circumstance and the promise of profit. Musgrave commanded the vessel, but Reynal's technical skills would prove equally important. Each man understood the risks of sailing into remote southern waters during the summer storm season, but sealing expeditions had been conducted in these regions for decades. There was precedent, and there was potential reward. The Grafton carried supplies for several months: salted meat, flour, tea, tools, firearms, and ammunition. She was adequately provisioned for the work ahead. On December 29, 1863, the schooner entered the waters near the Auckland Islands. Weather conditions were deteriorating. The storm came from the west. Visibility dropped as fog rolled across the water. The Grafton was navigating the eastern coast of Auckland Island, searching for a safe anchorage. Musgrave knew the coastline was treacherous, but he had charts and experience. The wind increased. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets. At approximately 9 in the evening on January 3, 1864, the Grafton struck a submerged rock near the entrance to Carnley Harbor. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The hull breached, water poured into the lower compartments. The crew scrambled to assess the damage, but within minutes it became clear the vessel could not be saved. Musgrave ordered the men to salvage what they could. They worked through the night in darkness and rain, hauling supplies onto the shore of a narrow inlet. Tools, canvas, rope, flour, firearms, clothing, and navigational instruments were pulled from the wreck before the Grafton settled deeper into the water. By dawn, the schooner was partially submerged, her masts tilted at unnatural angles. The 5 men stood on the beach surrounded by salvaged cargo. They were soaked, exhausted, and stranded. The nearest settlement was over 400 kilometers away. No rescue would come. No ship was expected in these waters. The realization settled over them quietly. The Auckland Islands were not on any commercial route. Sealing vessels occasionally passed through, but these visits were irregular and had declined sharply in recent years due to overhunting. The men understood this. Musgrave had sailed these waters before. He knew they could not rely on chance discovery. The group held a meeting on the second day. Musgrave proposed 2 options: wait for a passing ship, or attempt to build a vessel capable of reaching New Zealand. Waiting was passive and uncertain. Building a boat would require months of labor and carried no guarantee of success. The men decided to pursue both strategies simultaneously. They would construct a permanent shelter and prepare for a long stay, while also beginning work on an escape vessel. The immediate priority was survival. The weather was cold and wet. The salvage supplies included canvas for temporary shelter, but a more durable structure would be necessary. Reynal, with his engineering background, took the lead in planning a cabin. The forest provided timber. The wreck provided iron, nails, and tools. They chose a site near the beach, sheltered by trees and accessible to fresh water from a nearby stream. The ground was cleared. Logs were cut and shaped. The men worked methodically, aware that the quality of their shelter would determine their ability to endure the coming winter. Leadership among the group was collaborative. Musgrave maintained formal authority as captain, but Reynal's technical expertise made him indispensable. Forbes and Harris contributed physical labor. McLaren, though young, proved capable. Conflict was minimal in these early weeks. Survival required cooperation, and cooperation was maintained. The cabin they built became known as Epigwait, a name Musgrave recorded in his journal without explanation of its origin. Construction took several weeks. The structure measured approximately 6 meters by 4 meters, built from logs notched and fitted together. The roof was layered with bark, moss, and canvas to shed rain. A stone fireplace was constructed along one wall, with a chimney fashioned from rocks and clay. Reynal designed and built a forge using stones and salvaged iron. This forge allowed the men to heat and reshape metal from the wreck, creating tools that would otherwise be unavailable. He fashioned knives, hooks, hinges, and nails. The forge became central to their survival, enabling repairs and innovations that extended the usefulness of their limited resources. The interior of the cabin was simple. Bunks were built along the walls using timber and canvas. A table and benches occupied the center. Shelves held salvaged provisions and equipment. The space was cramped, but it provided protection from wind and rain. A door was installed, and small windows allowed limited light. The men established a division of labor. Musgrave and Reynal handled planning and leadership. Forbes and Harris managed hunting and foraging. McLaren assisted where needed. Each man contributed according to his abilities. Tasks were rotated to prevent monotony and resentment. By the end of February 1864, Epigwait was complete. The cabin was functional, weatherproof, and insulated against the cold. It represented the first significant achievement of their stranded existence, proof that organization and skill could impose order on their situation. The men moved inside. The rhythm of daily life began. Food was obtained through hunting and gathering. Seals were available on nearby beaches, though their numbers had diminished compared to earlier decades. The men used firearms when ammunition allowed, and clubs when it did not. Seal meat was tough but nutritious. The fat provided oil for lamps and cooking. Seabirds nested on the cliffs. Eggs were collected when accessible. Shellfish could be gathered at low tide along the rocky shoreline. Edible roots and plants grew in the forest, though variety was limited. Reynal, drawing on his knowledge, identified which species were safe to consume. The men developed a system for preserving food. Seal meat was smoked over the fire or salted using seawater boiled down in salvaged pots. Portions were rationed carefully to ensure supplies lasted between successful hunts. Cooking was a communal activity. Meals were simple but regular. Fire was essential. The men maintained a continuous flame in the cabin's fireplace, knowing that relighting it in damp conditions could be difficult. Wood was plentiful, and a rotation was established for gathering fuel. The forge required higher temperatures, achieved using a bellows Reynal constructed from wood and canvas. Discipline was maintained through routine. The men rose at dawn, ate breakfast, and divided into work parties. Some hunted, others gathered materials, and Reynal often worked at the forge or on repair projects. Afternoons involved maintenance of the cabin, preparation of food, and completion of smaller tasks. Evenings were spent near the fire. Musgrave kept a journal. Raynal sketched designs for tools and future projects. Conversation was limited, but not absent. Sundays were observed as days of rest, a practice Musgrave insisted upon. The men refrained from heavy labor and held informal religious observances. This structure provided psychological relief, a demarcation of time that prevented the days from blurring into a single undifferentiated stretch of survival. The psychological challenge of isolation became apparent as months passed. The men were confined to a small area, dependent on one another, with no certain prospect of rescue. Frustration, boredom, and despair were constant threats. Musgrave's journal served as both record and therapy. He documented weather, food supplies, work completed, and observations of the natural environment. The act of writing imposed meaning on the passage of time. Musgrave believed firmly in the value of order and leadership, and his journal reflected this philosophy. Raynal approached survival as an engineering problem. He designed improvements to the cabin, experimented with new tools, and planned the construction of an escape vessel. His mind remained occupied with technical challenges, which insulated him from hopelessness. He also taught the others skills in metalworking and construction, sharing knowledge that increased the group's collective capability. Religious faith provided structure for some. Musgrave led prayers on Sundays. The ritual offered comfort and a sense of continuity with the world they had left behind. Whether the men believed deeply or simply participated out of habit, the practice reinforced group cohesion. Conflict was managed through communication and compromise. Disagreements arose over work assignments, food distribution, and long-term strategy, but the men understood that disunity could be fatal. Resentments were expressed and addressed rather than allowed to fester. Musgrave and Raynal, though different in temperament and approach, respected one another's contributions. This mutual respect set a tone for the group. Winter brought darkness, cold, and relentless rain. The men spent more time inside the cabin. Physical activity decreased. The psychological weight of isolation intensified. They endured through routine, discipline, and the shared understanding that survival required cooperation. By mid-1864, the men had concluded that waiting for rescue was unsustainable. No ships had appeared. The wreck of the Grafton remained visible at low tide, a constant reminder of their predicament. Musgrave and Raynal agreed that an attempt must be made to reach civilization. Raynal proposed building a small sailing vessel capable of carrying 3 men to Stewart Island, the southernmost inhabited part of New Zealand, approximately 300 kilometers to the northwest. The journey would be dangerous, but it was possible. The alternative was indefinite isolation. The boat would be constructed from salvaged materials and timber cut from the forest. Raynal designed a vessel roughly 7 meters in length with a shallow draft suitable for navigating coastal waters. The hull would be built using planks shaped and fitted by hand. A mast and rigging would be fashioned from salvaged rope and canvas. Construction began in July 1864 and continued through the following months. The work was exhausting. Planks had to be cut, shaped, and joined with precision. Iron nails and fastenings were forged at the workshop. Caulking was improvised using seal fat and canvas fibers. Every component required improvisation and adaptation. The men's physical condition deteriorated as the project advanced. Inadequate nutrition, exposure to cold, and months of hard labor took their toll. Hands became calloused and cracked. Injuries were common. Fatigue was constant. Yet the boat slowly took shape. Progress was measured in weeks and months. The hull was completed by the end of 1864. Rigging and sail assembly continued into early 1865. Testing and adjustments followed. The vessel, though crude, appeared seaworthy. Raynal christened her rescue. The second winter on the Auckland Islands was harder than the first. The men's bodies had been worn down by more than a year of inadequate diet and physical strain. Symptoms of scurvy appeared: swollen gums, loosening teeth, joint pain, and slow-healing wounds. They recognized the signs but had limited means to address them. Fresh vegetables were unavailable. Seal meat and foraged roots did not provide sufficient nutrition. Injuries accumulated. A cut that would normally heal in days took weeks. Fatigue became chronic. Simple tasks required greater effort. Morale declined. The completion of the rescue offered hope, but also anxiety. The journey ahead was perilous. Failure would likely mean death. The men continued their routines, but the energy and discipline that had characterized the first months were harder to sustain. Conversations became shorter. Silences lengthened. The cabin felt smaller. Time lost its clear boundaries. Days repeated without variation. Musgrave's journal entries from this period are brief and factual. He noted weather conditions, food supplies, and work completed, but little else. The psychological burden of leadership weighed on him. He had brought these men into the Southern Ocean, and their survival remained uncertain. Reynal focused on final preparations for the rescue. He tested the rigging, checked the hull for leaks, and calculated provisions needed for the journey. His technical focus provided structure, but even he could not ignore the physical toll. The group held a meeting in June 1865. 3 men would sail in the rescue: Musgrave, Reynal, and Harris. Forbes and McLaren would remain at Epigwait, maintaining the cabin and awaiting rescue. If the voyage succeeded, a ship would return for them. If it failed, all 5 men would likely die. On July 19, 1865, after 20 months on the Auckland Islands, the rescue was launched. Weather conditions were as favorable as could be expected. The wind was steady, the sea relatively calm. Musgrave, Reynal, and Harris loaded the small vessel with provisions, navigational instruments, and what little remained of their strength. Forbes and McLaren stood on the beach and watched the boat move away from shore. No words were recorded. The rescue turned northwest and disappeared into the gray expanse of the Southern Ocean. The voyage took several days. Musgrave navigated using a salvaged compass and sextant. The men took turns at the helm and managing the sail. Water came over the sides periodically, requiring constant bailing. Sleep was minimal. Cold was unrelenting. On July 23, 1865, the rescue reached the southern coast of Stewart Island. The 3 men landed near a small settlement. They were gaunt, weak, and barely able to walk, but they were alive. Word was sent to Invercargill, the nearest substantial town on New Zealand's South Island. The authorities were alerted. A rescue ship, the Flying Scud, was dispatched immediately to the Auckland Islands. Captain Musgrave provided coordinates and described the location of Epigwait. The vessel departed within days. On August 2, 1865, the Flying Scud reached Carnley Harbor. Forbes and McLaren, who had been watching the horizon for weeks, saw the ship approach. They signaled from the shore. The rescue was completed without incident. All 5 men survived. The crew of the Grafton returned to civilization after 20 months of isolation. They were examined by doctors, provided with food and care, and eventually resumed their lives. Musgrave returned to England. Reynal published an account of the ordeal, titled Wreck of the Grafton, which became a significant contribution to survival literature. The other men dispersed, their later lives largely unrecorded. The survival of the Grafton crew is notable not for dramatic rescue or individual heroism, but for sustained cooperation. The men came from different countries, spoke different languages, and had no prior bond. Yet they worked together with consistent discipline and mutual respect. Leadership was shared. Skills were pooled. Conflict was managed. Routine was maintained. The cabin at Epigwait stood for decades after their departure. Later expeditions to the Auckland Islands reported finding the structure intact, a small monument to human endurance and ingenuity. Eventually, weather and time reclaimed it. The Auckland Islands remain uninhabited. The forests grow dense. The wind continues. The sea breaks against the cliffs. Ships do not pass here. What the men of the Grafton endured is part of the historical record. It is not a story of triumph, but of persistence, not of conquest, but of adaptation. They survived because they chose to work together, because they maintained discipline when despair was easier, and because they believed that effort could overcome isolation. The wreck lies somewhere beneath the water near Carnley Harbor, unseen and unmourned. The men who sailed her are long dead. What remains is the record of what they did, and the quiet fact that they survived.